sometimes you got to think about the use case and work back to whether that's the right solution or not. When you think about it, kids, you know, their language is more like Yoda than it is another adult, especially in the early, they literally flip sounds, and then they lisp and they underpronounce and they over punctuate and they elongate and they literally just don't follow and they change their behavior rapidly. Even the same child, every couple of months, is changing their language, right, as they learn. And all that kind of, compounds a lot on when you think about how traditional speech recognition systems are built. Even the new approach, right, end to end, it has an expectation of what is being said, and it leans quite heavily on that prediction. And that was the big difference in speech technology from 10, 15 years ago versus what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years versus what we're seeing now, right?
Right.
Is that language modeling really took off in the last 10 years. And that's where a lot of the acceleration in performance happened.
Trish Scanlon, welcome to the Voicebot podcast.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for being here.
I should say welcome back. I think it's been like almost 3 or 4 years since you've been
on. Yeah, pre-pandemic. That's all I remember.
Yes, it was. So like 2019. So it's got to be 4 years now.
Yeah.
A lot has happened in the world since then, not the least of which the pandemic, but lots happened in your business too. And I really felt like in 2019, your business was really taking off, and it's only accelerated since then. So why don't we start there? Actually, I think this would be really good to level set. I mean, we're friends. We've known each other a long time, but I'm not sure everybody knows the story. And you started working on this issue of speech recognition for children a long time ago, and that led to the founding of SoapBox Labs. So why don't you give people just sort of the quick summary of that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an engineer. I have a PhD in speech recognition. AI, as the voice AI space, we're now calling it. So I've been in the space a very long time, and I'd worked across academia, I'd worked across industry, I'd worked at big tech, where we were doing speech recognition for years, and it was back in 2013 when I was actually observing my own daughter interacting with apps. It was the iPad era, app millionaires. Do you remember that? And noticing, I was giving my daughter educational apps and services and getting her to play pre-literacy stuff. She wasn't even 4 at the time. And I really just noticed that, one, they'd no way of assessing whether she was actually able to recall or pronounce sounds and words. And then when I dug into it, it was like, oh, there's no speech tech for kids. Actually, okay, here's speech tech. Let's see if it works for kids. And the more I dug into it, it's like, it really doesn't work for kids. Therefore, there's nothing available for education and literacy and language learning. And it was kind of like that light bulb moment ago. And I'd spent my whole career working in the area of adult speech recognition. And so had all my colleagues, and none of us, unbeknownst to us, that we'd focused very solely on a problem and just viewed kids as just, I know, they're slightly different, voices a little squeaky or something. And then the more you dug in, going, oh no, they're fundamentally very different physically, behaviorally, language-wise, and all of this culminated into something that required a bespoke proprietary solution for kids. So that was the path I went on from 2013 onwards.
Well, and I think it's super interesting too, because you think about it, sometimes it's the thing right in front of you that's the hardest to recognize. And you didn't see it until you had this sort of unique moment because of the iPad and because children were using it and because there were all these apps coming out. And if we think about speech recognition, part of it too is reinforced by the fact that all the data was adult human voices. There really wasn't anything for kids that in at a scale, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole adage of, don't work with children and animals. It's like, it's kind of like this joke we often use inside, because it's really difficult. It's so easy to accumulate large volumes of data from adults in any application field. But there are difficulties, challenges. You can't incentivize children the same way as you can incentivize an adult. You can't, there's these days there are more data protections around. COPPA in the US and GDPR in the EU and elsewhere in the world, and it was just a case of, that's not easy to come by. It's really, really hard to build this. Kids are different. It was just, there were so many challenges. And to be honest, if I'd known all the challenges ahead of us, I don't know if I would have wandered in there as confidently as I did in 2013, but it was been really rewarding because, it took a lot of learning and patience on all our parts to get this right.
Okay. And I do want to get into sort of like the business and sort of the use cases and the value and stuff like that in just a minute. But I think it might be interesting just to like talk about this idea of speech recognition and like what is state of the art for speech recognition. We've seen a lot of changes in that space over the last couple of years. I mean, and you just think about, Whisper coming out and Seamless from Meta, OpenAI's Whisper and Seamless from Meta. But like maybe just break down very simply the fundamental elements of speech recognition when you're thinking about this as a researcher and building a system for recognition. And then maybe differentiate between the adults and children. Because I'm wondering, is it really just you just swap out the data set? Because I think it's more than that.
Yeah, it's more than that. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the old approach for speech recognition was like you had acoustic model. You build models of what the sounds, the small components that make up speech, right? And they're called phonemes. There's like 40, 50 of them, depending on your dialect. And then once you'd figured out what the speech kind of sounds like, then you'd feed it into a language model, which kind of used the language structures and the prediction of what was most likely said, right? The expectation what was said. And we hear a lot about language models now. So people are beginning to understand what a language, it predicts what you most likely said based on what the population usually says. And that's kind of like the older approach. The newer approach is this end-to-end approach where you put in the audio and then, it does the whole thing in one go. And you have the transcriptions of what was said and it does this end-to-end matching. That's the newer version of it. And that's what most people are employing now. And that's fine. And that works great. And again, I it's always interesting to me when, engineers and technology and scientists ever go about something, sometimes you got to think about the use case and work back to whether that's the right solution or not. When you think about it, kids, their language is more like Yoda than it is another adult, especially in the early, they literally flip sounds, and then they lisp and they underpronounce and they over punctuate and they elongate and they literally just don't follow and they change their behavior rapidly. Even the same child every couple of months is changing their language, right, as they learn. And all that kind of, compounds a lot on when you think about how traditional speech recognition systems are built. Even the new approach, right, end to end, it has an expectation of what is being said, and it leans quite heavily on that prediction. And that was the big difference in speech technology from 10, 15 years ago versus what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years versus what we're seeing now, right? Is that language modeling really took off in the last 10 years. And that's where a lot of the acceleration in performance happened. It wasn't really around the acoustics so much. It was just, and that's when we started seeing Google Home and Alexa and all those start to perform pretty well because they were beginning to predict what was somebody in their room, in their kitchen was most likely what music they were trying to play or whatever. And then same with the end-to-end systems, we're leaning quite heavily. And then large language models where we're going to scrape the entire internet. We're going to start predicting what's most likely said. And then you get a 5-year-old, who just like blurts out something all muddled up and just starts messing with the system that was never designed for that.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, people with English as a second language kind of struggle with these things too.
Yes.
Right? You often hear people saying that. It doesn't work as well for them because they're not speaking in a very predicted way. And therefore it starts to break down. So we had to come at this, not just from a data problem, but also in how we build it to get the best response for children.
Right, because the prediction model being very important there, if children are using a slightly different speech pattern, maybe not following the grammatical rules as strictly as I say humans are conditioned to, or adult humans are conditioned to do. That's interesting. Now, you've mentioned end-to-end a couple of times, and maybe it'd be useful for people to understand that sort of the ASR, NLU being separate together and, how you think about that. And also how you think about that changes it, because this whole idea of actually having additional context before you make the transcription prediction.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a bundling. It works really, really well when you've got large volumes of data, which you want to do, and it kind of just makes, kind of conflates the problem. You just put in audio, whereas the old approaches, I don't think they're dead completely, like at all. It depends on the application. It's just trying to do it all in one big system as opposed to broken down into acoustic and language components. I think it's an interesting way because a lot of if you think about, let's break down the use case a little bit more, and then it's kind of easier to see what works and what doesn't. If you ask a child what their favorite color is, and the child says green, because my toddler niece said this, she kept saying green instead of green, which was really cute. And we all laughed. And then I went, yeah, that's really interesting. But like a prediction model, whether it's end to end actually or the old approach, would probably say, well, there's no such word as geen. So they probably meant bean or mean or something like that, and then would substitute in and would just flat out get it wrong, right? Whereas we start looking at it a little bit differently. Well, if we could give the system some context, like the child was asked what the favorite color was, how well did they say any of the colors? And actually they said green pretty well, except for they just didn't pronounce that, or they were too nasally, and it's not an all or nothing, but a lot of these transcription, I call them transcription, I think is a better description of speech recognition systems. They're trying to transcribe and predict, will just drop the ball on that completely, and the child get a big fat zero from arguably what should be, from a human perspective, they said green, not bad. Like we understood it, right? Because we knew the context. And I think one of the things that speech recognition and actually any AI system sometimes fall over is in a lack of context. And even though the context is there, because it's not that hard to let the system know what the question was, we drop that because we're trying to build some generic model that works for every single application
Right.
use case, right? And we're going, the information's right there. Why can't we just take context and make the system better, make it work for a 4-year-old or somebody who's maybe English isn't a strong a component for their language component. So I think there's a lot of ways that we kind of try and generalize. And I think sometimes what we did in SoapBox was to say, well, let's look at the use case. And our system works, this particular aspect of our system, we do the transcription too as well. And that's a separate, we do 2 different products really, like transcription and fluency, but we do this earlier product. It works for multiple choice. It works for questions. It works for pronunciation down to the phonetic level of each word, each phoneme within a word and then in a sentence. So it's really useful for asking a question, search terms, multiple choice, pronunciation for an English language learner, pronunciation for a child, stuff that if you think about the use case and work back to how you should solve the problem, as opposed to say, here's a system, works for everything, now just make it work. And then it's like square peg, round hole, not really working, but we just put up with it because that's the way it's built. As opposed to really saying, well, and I think some people I think we're all like, with AI and the large language models going, oh, but this is the way it is and it works really well. And then I think what we're beginning to see a little bit of fracturing happening across the AI system. Well, is that really the best solution? And we are starting to see a little bit more customization again and baby LLMs and things like that coming back into play because, while they were mind-blowing sometimes, these things that then you go, oh, it doesn't work great for this system, so I'll fine-tune. And then you're getting back to kind of the older systems a little bit,
Yeah, domain specialization makes a big difference. I like people just kind of forget this, and like I understand this idea that you build general purpose technology first, and you want it to be flexible. It's usually better. It's kind of like you don't want to build a monolithic system today. You want to build something that's more flexible, and then you do domain customization on top of it. And I think it's really interesting that you started with the use case, and that helped you get to the answer more quickly. I think just like in terms of the trend of the technology, though, it almost looked like the performance improvements in the end-to-end systems were so much better than the abstracted systems where the NLU was separate, for example, that maybe NLU had seen its heyday. But then we bring in generative, and it really gives you this benefit of having the abstracted system. Now, you could still potentially do an end-to-end where they sort of pipe together, but I see a lot of people trying to do end-to-end right now, then to generative, and they're losing some of the benefits of the generative model in order to better understand the prediction of what the language is and what the user wants.
Yeah. I think, there's flexibility. I think it's okay. I think there's a couple of things, right? yes, we should build on the shoulders of the prior innovations, and I think that's a really nice way of looking at generative and the foundation models and how you fine tune them to get something better. Um, you know, I just think, I'm almost like I've seen the word generative AI in so many places and articles that it really shouldn't be. It's, people
True.
mean AI and they use generative AI because they can't get
Mhm.
it, out of their heads. Like, um, I think there's a place for generative AI and then there's a place for AI. And I think people are just kind of going down one path. And it depends on what your objective is and on what your use case is, depending on your resources, depending on your expertise, depending on what you're trying to solve. I just don't think they're a catch-all. I think, you can use them to improve things. Um, I think sometimes people just, we're trying to use something that's a new tool and it's great, but
Yeah.
it's not the solution for everything.
Well, I think it's pretty clear to people that a tool like ChatGPT is a generative solution because it's like generating novel text, in response to an answer. And it's something like Midjourney is like novel in terms of it's creating an image based on your text input, and it's going to be mostly different every time.
Mhm.
Uh, do you think of synthetic speech as being generative? Because I hear some people thinking it was generative and some not. In some ways, it's the original generative.
Yeah, it
And
is, yeah.
maybe I could even like put a finer point on this, like speech recognition is the original generative because basically it's just taking sounds and it's creating words out of the sounds. Um, but how do you think about it philosophically? I mean, you're a researcher, you're also an entrepreneur, but think about it.
I mean, we've been using generative AI for a long time, and we use it to create new text for the language models, like, based on,
Oh,
it's
for
been
synthetic
used.
data.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's synthetic data has always was generative AI. That's what we were kind of laughing when all this came out, going, "Oh, we need to start talking about what we've been doing for years in terms of generative AI because everybody's getting so excited about it." Like, it's like, we never called anything AI years ago. It was machine learning, but now we all
Yes, yes.
call it AI just to, keep up with the
Oh,
trends.
machine learning is back in vogue. They're like the
Oh,
cool
yeah,
kids.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
the
because it
cool
was a
kids only want to say
backlash
machine
against
learning
AI,
now.
is
Yeah.
it? Yeah. But it's the same thing, I mean, all of those things, how do I think about what's generative and what's not? I mean, yeah, yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. We've always kind of, in the world of, machine learning and AI, accepted the fact that these things were normal, but now they've been kind of categorized as something that's generative and builds on, are you talking about in terms of IP ownership? Like,
Well, I think really it's just an open question. It's because I think definitions matter, particularly in early markets and particularly when
Mhm,
things go mainstream. And I've seen this a lot where, like, I've known AI researchers for a long time. I
mhm.
knew AI researchers before anybody like cared about AI, right? And uh, and I see some confusion in terms of like when it was just AI researchers and a few of us other people who were involved in it, we all sort of knew the vernacular, the nomenclature. We knew what to call what when. But then all of a sudden, society decided it was interested, everybody
Mhm.
else. And I see it in some ways like the bad things. I see some of these long time, maybe some of our giants in the space, feeling like they're being left behind a little bit and they're a little offended that other people who are not as erudite as them are messing in their space and trying
Yeah.
to create new knowledge in the space that that's besides research knowledge. But at the same time, I think it creates a little bit of confusion in the market, and creating some definitions is helpful. I actually just decided well, I guess it was a year ago now, I just sort of looking at it and said, hey, if we're going to look at text, image, audio, and video, just start there. I mean, those are all generative solutions. I mean, frankly, if you want to use that term. Now, I put them all in synthetic media as well, which is I think is a broader character category, which includes like, characters and these other types of things, avatars,
Mhm,
things like more broadly, because what I found was they were all sort of working together and there's a sort of
mhm,
convergence when you
mhm.
used a lot of these different techniques together. I think the very basic level, we've got images, text, um,
Yeah.
sound and image and video, and like there's a generative technique versus other more deterministic techniques.
Yeah, yeah. I what I think is interesting about all these definitions and how we start thinking about them, I started breaking it down for people in a way of saying pre 22, mid 22, we didn't talk about generative AI.
Yeah.
We talked about narrow AI or weak AI and strong AI, which was, terrible name. But like narrow AI was speech recognition, right? here's some audio. I'm going to break it down into its component parts, use a language model in whatever way I'm going to do it. And but I'm going to be really good at it. I'm going to be able to possibly do, image classification for cancer screening better than a human can. I'm going to take data, massive amounts of multidimensional data, and do analysis and classify stuff and recognize stuff that humans aren't capable of. It's called narrow AI, but it's very, very powerful. But it couldn't just leap from.
Well, it was only called narrow AI because they wanted something called general AI, which
well,
is...
no, it was narrow because in my book it was narrow because it could do speech, but it couldn't do images, and it could do something like you could do, and generally you use some kind of expertise, annotations and knowledge to be able to do that, and then but then we started talking about. Before even we start talking about strong AI, right? So when you're talking about generative AI came into being, and then the foundation models actually don't exist. If you ask ChatGPT what's foundation models, it goes, as of what does it always say, like October 2021, the only people who ever mentioned the word foundation models was OpenAI, shockingly, right? But now in new regulation, foundation models in generative AI have actually now been mentioned in the EU AI Act. So we've had to, but that concept of a foundation model that you fine tune was always around in machine learning. We just didn't call it a foundation model.
Yeah, there is actually a late 2021 research paper that uses the term foundation models.
Okay.
The first place that I've seen it used. Now, there were some other people who were using it sort of like colloquially, but like the first place officially. But no one read that paper until July of 2022 when they did the update.
Okay.
Which was after it would have been. So I think it was not potentially in the original training data set for.
But I think that's so interesting. I'm in this field 25 years. I mean, the field is like 50, 60 years old. We just didn't call it foundation models. It was just like fine tuning a model. It wasn't a concept nobody had ever thought about, but it was just not. I'm just saying they're coining terms now. But what I often do now, if I'm actually speaking about AI, I actually break it down. I talk about narrow AI, and then I explain what generative AI is, and I explain foundation models, and then we talk about strong AI or AGI, right?
Yes.
The super intelligence. And it's very helpful to do that for people because people just keep conflating the idea of narrow and strong and like I said, if I see the word generative AI and we're using correctly again, but it's really useful to people to go, okay, when we talk about generative AI, we're talking about this. When we talk about strong AI, we're talking about something that actually doesn't exist, but it could be very close, because of all the progress we've made here. And I think it's really helpful because it's in the public sphere. There is a lot of fear. So when we start breaking down into the component parts, then I think you can kind of relax a little bit and kind of figure, okay, here's where the immediate problems is, here are the near-term problems, and here are the long-term problems,
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about that was good. Like, and I actually like the emergence of the term foundation model because it's
me too. Yeah.
It abstracts it a little bit from large language models versus diffusion models and things like that. So since we're just talking about ASRs, I want to ask you about Whisper and Seamless. And maybe you could just break down how you think that's different, or maybe it's not that different from what we've seen from ASRs and transcription solutions in the past, because they seem strikingly different. I know that there is a difference in terms of the way the model and certainly the amount of data that they're using. But like, what's your impression as someone who's been doing this for 20 years?
I think it's data. I mean, I haven't actually gone into the details to see what the difference between the two of them are versus what. I think much like the transformer code, I don't think it's that revolutionary. I think it is the data. When you actually employ, what's it, is it 680,000 hours or something like that to Whisper?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that sounds right. Or at least one of the languages. I don't remember.
And all languages, but predominantly English, right?
Yeah,
so what
English,
people do, if they have some basis, and it's probably, and again, I haven't looked into the details. It might be, I'm sure there's some aspect of sharing, between phonemes and sounds and stuff like that, that they're not starting from every language from scratch. But if your language of interest hasn't been accommodated for very well, let's say it didn't have enough data, you can actually take the foundation model and fine tune it with your own data.
Right.
I think for me, that's the big difference in the market, right? You can actually look at these models, and then with audio and transcription data, you can actually fine tune them, which you couldn't do before like that. I mean, that's almost like a service that's now being provided to the market that didn't exist with Google and those guys before. Again, you need data, you need knowledge, you need transcriptions, you need annotation. We're back to this again, right? But the foundation for these large transcriptions is there. So I think those type of things are definitely going to move the field on, particularly in terms of language, like under-resourced languages, which has always been an issue. Like English, like to be honest, English is it's just been slam dunk for most of it. If you try and pair off into any other language beside English, forget about it if you're looking for kids or adults. It's just a dearth of data out there, and that's got a lot to do with where the data's come from in the beginning. How long have people been collecting data? Are people collecting data for profit, or are they actually building products? Are they making the data available? Was it universities? Can you license it? Once you go outside of English, it just starts to dry up automatically.
Well, and that's why it's so impressive. So I don't even know what Whisper's up to now. It was at 99. That would have been 6 months ago or something like that. I know. But then Seamless from Meta started with 96. I mean, they launched it with 96.
Yeah.
And so and also they launched it with translation. That you can take something and it'll translate it automatically, not only identify it. Like Whisper was very good at identifying from the beginning which language. So I think that's really fascinating, and it makes me think that maybe because they're so good and they're not end-to-end systems, that well, maybe they are end-to-end.
No, Whisper. I think Whisper's end-to-end. I'm not
I
sure.
guess it is end-to-end.
I'm presuming. Yeah.
It's end-to-end without an NLU, right? So
yeah, exactly. I mean, if they're just transcribing for you, then you can put the intelligence on beyond that.
Yeah. That's really interesting. But I just think that's super fascinating. Now, let's get back to SoapBox. So you saw this problem. You said, "Oh, this problem should be solved." And was your first use case your language learning, or was it reading comprehension, or was it helping kids with dyslexia, like you just announced?
No, in the very beginning, I mean, I kind of was looking at, like I said, I've been in speech recognition for a long time at that point already. And I was really looking at this going, there's a massive amount of value to be had to be able to help. My head was to teach kids to read, right? We started with young kids. And again, hindsight, 2020 and all that. We started with the most difficult age group, the most difficult problem. Older kids, the older you get a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old, they're much easier, right? Because they're getting closer to that predictive way of behaving and their language and stuff like that. You start with the young kids, it's harder. But it was almost because we also decided to hit this education. And the thinking was, we want to be able to do it in education. And it has to work well. This has to be state of the art. It has to work so well that it works on a par with a teacher doing an assessment, right, or practice, whatever. It has to work for every child in the classroom, right? It can't just work for a couple of privileged kids whose that accent or dialect is representative and all the data sets out there. It has to work for everybody. Or just in my head, and it had to work in real world noise environments. Had to work without those headset mics because 5-year-olds are just going to keep hitting them. And we set the bar really high in all those respects, just saying, we just didn't feel there was a point bringing out a product that couldn't hit all those, because it wouldn't, once the initial novelty had worn off, it just wouldn't be used by teacher. It would just kind of fade out. Or, once a teacher and parents and school districts and schools were cottoned on to the fact that it wasn't working for that demographic, they dropped that product in the heartbeat.
Well, don't you think it's kind of like self-driving cars in this way? And that self-driving cars are already basically better than humans by a large margin. But the fact that they have, this chance of something bad going on, which we know that chance is much higher with human drivers. We see this all the time. They're like, oh, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. And I kind of feel it's the same thing. It's that if you had any crack in the armor, that they were going to be just oh, no. Even though the systems even that they might even say that against are better than your average teacher, and maybe better than many of your best teachers.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was kind of a case of, no, I mean, look, it's hard enough to, you talk about transforming industries and stuff like that. I mean, we know what education, the bar is high. The attention to this is super high. People are really sensitive to how kids are impacted by these technologies. You have huge amounts of money going in to try to address long-term inequities in the classroom, and then you bring in a technology that doesn't work for more than 50% of the classroom.
Right.
For me, it was kind of no, this, And I do get your point, right? Like, I do get your point about self-driving cars, and I don't think these are outliers. I don't think when it comes to bias and equity, it's an outlier and it's the odd case where it gets it wrong. Really isn't. I mean, I think there was a Stanford study about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and it was reported on by the New York Times, where there was like 30% different errors between black and white speakers. And this was from all the big tech speech recognition performance and smart speakers. That's fairly significant. You bring that kind of technology into the classroom, like, I mean, again, you get thrown out once that's kind of uncovered. So I think that I agree with the premise. You got to be careful that you don't throw out a whole technology over outliers, and you kind of got to, but you have to at least look at the users, and is it represented? Are you going to harm, telling a kid that they're wrong when they're right is really damaging to confidence, and telling them they're right when they're wrong is really damaging to their education, right? So, in this case, getting it right for everybody in the classroom was super important to do it, or we knew we didn't have a business, because why would anybody start replacing, and we're not, like, what we're doing is trying to supplement what a teacher does anyway. And that's the initial use cases that you're going, okay, teacher does not have time to assess every kid in the classroom while they're practicing every week. And they know they should, right? Because all the research say that's how you progress. But this technology, or you've overcrowded classrooms, or you've got kids with, like, lack of access, they don't have home help, whatever, you can actually bring a technology in if it works for everybody. And it's not that hard, mind you. I mean, it's not that it's not that hard, because then I'm saying what SoapBox has done is not hard. It's achievable to build something that mitigates bias. It is, if you build it from the beginning with that in mind, it's not that hard. I think people kind of view bias mitigation and accuracy and all those things really hard to achieve. It is hard to achieve if you've never considered it before.
It depends on your objective function, right? I mean, this is like, goes back, people will understand that. It's just like, if you want to do it for everybody, then you start with that. If you're just trying to get to something that's functional very quickly, you're going to optimize, that's going to work, but then you're going to have all this technical debt that's not going to work for these other use cases, whether it's accents, regional differences, dialects.
Yeah, and 100%. And look, in gaming, maybe people don't care. Like, maybe in certain areas, they don't care about certain type, because they don't sell in those areas, or those areas. We're talking about education. Like, I mean, that's what I'm saying. The bar is high. It was a really impact-driven decision to go after. We could really change how education is done, or bringing AI that's actually useful, and kids could practice, and they could have fun, and it could be engaging, because there could be characters and games, and they're learning to read. I mean, how cool is that? Like, if you do it right. And we just didn't think we'd have a business if we didn't do it right. So it was kind of very, there was the ethical point of view of doing it right, because we wanted to work for every child in the classroom, but it was kind of like, there's commercial sense to this as well, right? And I think I do this a lot. And I actually do talk about ethical AI a lot, because I kind of, people always kind of go as if this building ethical AI is kind of like an eye roll, and it's like woke or something. It's just commercial sense. This is like, you're building a product that's going to go into the market. Surely you want it to work for everybody. Is that not, like, sensible? It's not like, you're trying just to achieve something just to, percent. It can work on both sides, like, and again, and I urge anybody that's thinking about building something from scratch, going, like, yeah, you could rush it out a little quicker by doing it that way, but surely it makes business sense if you're trying to get something and as wide as possible adoption in the market, that it works for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that it makes total sense. I mean, there's certain use cases where, for sure, you have to look at the entire population. And I can just see for you. Now, we didn't talk about this last time, because I would have remembered this. This is a really interesting concept, that if you try to put something in the US, the UK, Ireland, Canada, like your first markets, sort of the largest English speaking markets, and it only works in one region or with one accent, you can't get it adopted, because the school systems work together. It's at least an entire state, which is basically the size of a lot of countries in some cases, but it's, the entire country usually is going to have some sense of this. And, like, you're going to have some level of proficiency across the board, and probably a very high level.
Yeah. Scale, right? I mean, nobody builds a startup and doesn't think about scale from the beginning. If you do, it's very short-sighted. And, like, scale for us meant, well, we're going to build the system once, and obviously, you accumulate tech debt in a certain aspect, but you're not going to have it work for northeastern US accents, and then suddenly you got to go rebuild when you bring that to California and rebuild in the UK and rebuild. Like it just makes it, scale is something that's really important in all startups. And for me, when it comes to speech technology, scale means accommodating everybody, that you don't have to go, rebuild every time you got to take it into a new geography.
Yeah, and we don't have to go into too much detail on the use cases. I think people could read about them in Voicebot or in SoapBox. You guys have talked about them, but I think it is useful just to like talk about it. So, to tell people like some of the current applications that are being used in the field of this
Yeah.
technology.
So it's used early literacy, so kids learning to read, so their phonic sounds, their blending, decoding, their spelling, recognizing letter names and letter sounds, letter names. So it's practice, assessment. So how well can they pronounce, how fluent they are. So the idea of assessment, but also screening. And screening is when and I love this application. It's kind of like today a lot of kids are caught for dyslexia at 8 and 10 when they haven't succeeded in reading.
Right.
But the markers are there and the indicators are there from a 4 and 5-year-old. So now kids across the US are being screened for dyslexia before they ever enter school. And this is amazing, right? So it makes so much sense. The problem with sequencing, you can show a kid a picture of a ball, a tree, a house, car, whatever, and they can say it, right? The same problem with sequencing that happens in letters happens with images too. So before a kid ever even learns to read, you can actually get an indicator of
Wow.
but isn't that amazing? So you could save a child like 4 or 5 years of confidence bruising, like challenging, I just think
Where they fall
confidence.
behind too, because
Yeah,
everyone just assumes, okay, they're working at their level. When if
no,
you
yeah.
just intervened, provided the appropriate curriculum and support for them, then they wouldn't get behind so that when they're 12, they have all this catch up to do.
Yeah, exactly. And again, let's get back to the economics of it. Like, whatever about what it does to a child's confidence to have years and years and thinking they can't read. Um, it's also it's kind of costs 4 times as much to intervene with an 8-year-old as it does with a 4-year-old, right? Because they've missed so much and trying to catch them up. You catch
Yes.
them at 4 and 5, you get them the right supports. But this has been mandated across the US. I mean, I love that it's not on this side of the ocean, unfortunately, but across the US, screening is mandated now. So there are loads of really cool companies coming out with automatic screeners, and one of them in particular is using it we're using SoapBox in the background as well, and Spin-Out from Boston Children's Hospital is doing that as well, to be able to screen at 4 and 5 like as well, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I just really like this idea too. You talk about scale for your business, and in this case, it's not just like technology scale. You're talking about adoption. Like the scale of adoption could only happen if you can serve like a wide population. But there's also this idea of scale in education. So it's on the user side of this. And I think we all understand that teachers are very important, but they don't have infinite time.
Mm.
And we always want that personal attention child by child. But every time they're giving that personal attention to one child, they're not giving it to another child. And so anything we can do to create some more personalization using technology so that they can intervene where they need to and give that and
Yeah.
and supplement their ability to do that, to me, just is going to have tremendous upside. I don't know how long it's going to be till we feel it as a society.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a 10-year lag time, 20-year lag time. But I just have a feeling that as these technologies are more widely adopted, a generation from now, maybe sooner, we're going to see a much more literate and maybe just a much savvier populace as a result of this.
100%. Like, voice technology is going to be huge. It's going to be letting teachers getting back to teach. So when they spend that, small amount of individual time with a kid is really valuable. And the kids who aren't can be getting on with their own personalized learning paths. Like, that's hugely valuable. And again, saving a kid, from, not achieving literacy, which is their fundamental right, actually really doesn't. There's been research to show it impacts their entire life. It impacts their future potential. It impacts GDP, it impacts economies. It impacts personally on a child's life and an economy on a whole as well. Their chance of end up in poverty or prison or, all these things are amazing.
Yes.
It's for all our benefit. But AI in general, like voice technology in particular around literacy, English language learning, there's massive amounts of of English bilingual children, like 20% kids coming from bilingual homes, and a lot of times they end up in as if they need intervention, and they don't need intervention. Their reading's fine. It's just the language, and be able to distinguish that. We're doing some work on Spanish now to be able to
Yeah,
do
I
that.
want to talk about that. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
the
this is
Gates
your first
Foundation.
extension beyond English for children,
Yeah,
correct?
exactly. We did some fundamental work on it a couple of years ago, and then we're now working with support of the Gates Foundation to build this out to productize it for children. To be able to support bilingual kids, to be able to support this exact issue, like English isn't a first language in the home. Making sure that kids who are in it need intervention are getting it's not just language support they need. I mean, it's a massive issue across the US and then globally to be looking at
Well,
Spanish as well.
yeah. So when you think about the Spanish language model, so obviously in the U.S., like people will be aware of that could be really helpful with bilingual. Plus, like there's a lot of people who only speak English. A lot of children who only speak Spanish when they first enter the school,
Yeah,
and so how do you assess them properly
yeah.
to figure that out? What about for the Spanish-speaking world? Because obviously that's very
Yeah.
large.
Oh, yeah.
The
Yeah,
third
yeah.
most populous language worldwide. So
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're going to start with the working with Gates and the US schools first, and then of course we'll be rolling it out globally. Where needed. At the moment, we do have clients and technology and products around the world for English, people using it for English language learning.
yes.
But again, to be able to use it for literacy and assessment and all that in Spanish-speaking countries, and then for Spanish language learning as well.
Oh,
So
so
yeah,
and just for English language learning, I think that's a really interesting idea that a lot of people probably don't recognize that as a potential opportunity or maybe a current
yeah,
business for you. And like they think of, Berlitz, so Duolingo and all these different ways that people learn a second language. But those are all targeted towards adults, really. I mean,
yeah,
there's kids who use them. Obviously, Duolingo is very friendly, kid friendly in some
yeah,
ways. But it's not just the speech recognition might be for adults in many of those cases, but it's also the teaching style,
yeah.
as opposed to a teaching style that we would, uh, I guess, align or consider more in line with, what we would expect in primary education.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're working with clients across the world and a good few in Asia at the moment and Europe, who are, I mean, they're building these really cool, engaging, fun products for kids as young as 2 and 3. And they're literally learning sounds, sounds and words and recognizing pictures. I mean, the pedagogy around that about what keeps kids engaged makes it fun and rewarding and not expensive, because it's definitely tutoring can be really expensive in certain countries. Opportunity to speak English can really benefit future prospects and stuff like that for kids. So we work with some amazing product developers who have developed these really cool voice first products. So the
Okay,
idea is you people who retrospectively put in voice as an assessment tool, and then
right,
people build voice from the beginning. That's cool.
exactly. So when it's used for foreign language learning, what accent do they choose if they're in Asia or somewhere else in the world?
I wouldn't say. I mean, we've got one client and he teaches. Again, it's not. I mean, we do all accents and dialects, right?
No,
So
no,
we
I know,
do
but when they're
how it
doing it, are
feels.
they trying to teach people like British
We work with
pronunciation,
one
American
UK.
pronunciation,
I mean, we
Irish
work with right.
pronunciation?
That's
What?
true. That's actually quite an interesting question. We work with one UK company that's really successful out in Asia, Lingumi, and that's very much a British accent
Yeah,
because
of
it's
course.
all driven there. And then we work with some American, US accent driven companies as well, are bringing out products in Asia. So I guess that's a preference for either the teachers, the school, or the parents who are choosing those.
Yeah, and I wonder maybe they have the choice of what they want to learn, but I wonder
Yeah,
what that'll do because I was just thinking this idea that I think it's been known for a long time that learning a language before generally the age of 12, I think,
yeah,
it's essentially the only way to have native
yeah,
fluency in terms of pronunciation
yeah.
facility. You can have facility with grammar and everything afterwards, but you generally have some sort of accent.
Yes, that's
Very
true.
hard
Yeah,
to get rid of. And if this starts getting pushed closer to youth, more accessible because it's more scalable, more affordable, all these
mhm,
things. I wonder if we're going to find a lot less accented speech
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
in
very well.
English, if this is the English language, and then if so, which accent, which
Yeah.
English, non-accented English speech or English accent will it be?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting in the speech recognition world. We always look at the phoneme breakdowns, these phoneme charts, and American English will be in the high 30s number of phonemes. I think Irish, Hiberno English, we call it,
Yeah.
has like 50. So because we're merging from an old accent into, an
Yeah, I
old language
understand.
into a newer one. So we've actually a lot more things. So it's harder for people to mimic an Irish accent as it is maybe an American accent, which I think is interesting. Again, yeah, maybe that's your preference. You want to sound like an Irish person? Go for
That's
it.
right. 33 and a turd,
Yeah.
right?
It's like another pint. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. Okay, so that's really interesting. I'm really glad you talked about that. The other thing I definitely wanted to get to today was some work that you've been doing. I think you're an AI ambassador for Ireland and, working in the EU, and you mentioned the EU AI Act earlier.
Yeah.
And that's something that probably has not received enough attention in general discussions, particularly in the technology space, because everyone's interested in the machines and what the machines can do, as
Mhm.
opposed to what the broader social context and regulatory context is going to be.
Yeah, so Ireland has an AI strategy, and part of the AI strategy was to appoint an AI ambassador. And this was like a year or a year and a half ago to help start a national conversation on AI, and then engage more broadly with the OECD and UNESCO and different countries. So I was appointed to that role, as well as, so it's just helping to start communicating around my own experience with ethical AI, looking at the EU AI Act, and helping as somebody with a background in AI to be able to help, particularly people like policymakers, politicians, people like that, people who are interested in the area, and people non-experts understand the issues with AI. And then along comes OpenAI and ChatGPT and Midjourney and all these ones. And also, we're not trying to start a national conversation now. What we're trying to do now is help people understand,
Yes.
w and the fear, as we discussed earlier. And, I talked about the different groups of AI. The Biden administration have a US, I think they call it the US, AI Bill of Rights, or something like that, where it's actually very well explained
Mhm.
about it's got like guardrails for how you create ethical AI and person-centered AI. It's not completely different to the EU AI Act, but the EU AI Act has more teeth, let's say. So in about 2 years, there will be, it'll be enacted, and there will be an AI Liability Act, and it's all about, so just like you have in, like, cybersecurity, or in finance, or in medicine, or in biotech, there's certain, you got to jump through a few hoops to be able to release products on the market. And it's kind of like, it's similar. It's not, um, the idea, I suppose, in the EU is just more, these are really powerful technologies. There are some really high risk use cases. If they're used incorrectly, it could impact somebody's life, let's say in finance, education, health. Therefore, if you are bringing those products to market, you need to just tick some boxes to say that you've actually thought about, the impacts, and how you address them.
Yeah, well, I've written recently about some of the tools that I supposedly identify AI generated text,
Oh yeah,
and
no.
how I think they're blatantly lying about um,
Yeah, yeah,
their
yeah, I've
accuracy
seen that,
rates.
yeah.
Particularly, what they do is they obfuscate their false positive rates, and like you're seeing kids who are getting failing grades as a result of this when it
Yeah,
may or may not be true, and like that can
yeah,
destroy a kid. And like some of these tech companies, I know they're just trying to save their business because they think they're going out of business, but it's not even the startups; it's the people who are really well established. Um, really, I just like to talk about unethical. I mean, and so
yeah,
this is like a completely this is a different type of thing, and I think they are not covered really, basically, on some of these rules that are out here, because it's not the type of thing that people are worried about.
yeah. Yeah, and I think, look, the EU, interestingly, the EU had been in preparation for this for like 2 years, 2.5 years. So
Yeah.
it's not like, and so I think that's kind of interesting. It was an unusual position to be in, that we'd actually been working on the background on this. It was just at the advent of all these generative AI tools have just actually changed the text in the last 6 months. But it's exactly what you're talking about. It's more about the impact. that it can have on somebody's life and your finance. There was some example of an AI system used a few years ago in the Netherlands, where the AI tool was flagging people for welfare fraud, and it was
Mhm.
incorrectly doing it because they hadn't actually quite tested it properly, and
Yeah, sure.
tens of thousands of people were cut off from welfare for months, and it took a long time to figure out where the problem was. And for those people, imagine how damaging that could have been to people who are already on welfare, like, and because these tools weren't tested, somebody had an idea to bring it out. So again, we know there's massive benefits to AI and to in all factors of life. So it's just kind of case of, okay, just pause for a second. All these there's so many use cases that won't actually ever have to be regulated, even
Yes.
via the EU AI Act, because they're not going to impact people's lives. It'll be the commercial reasons you'll want to employ to make sure it works for everybody. But then when it comes to real life impacts and real life impacts in people's lives, people need to pause and just look at, and I think there's a lot of people who talk about are pushing really hard against the regulation, saying regulation will stifle innovation and all that. But like I said, there's other fields like biotech, medtech, fintech, all these other fields that operate pretty okay within a regulated space, like, and they innovate. It just needs, a little bit more thought, a little bit of a pause.
So as
And
an innovator, then you're not concerned about this, like crushing, because it strikes me that, so for example, we'll just look at something very specific in the EUAI Act, and with the caveat that it's not passed yet. There's still
yeah,
negotiation, tri-party negotiations around it. But you're not concerned about like the transparency rules, because some of the transparency rules, if you look at it, there's not a practical way for, let's say, foundation models, large language models in particular, to comply. And if you look at it, Stanford did a recent study, which I thought was very interesting, where they looked at, I think it was 10 or 12 large language models. Everyone can read about that in Synthedia. I did a full breakdown on it.
yeah.
But it showed like one of the models was 75% compliant with the items. Like they only actually looked at like 2/3 of the items, because like a third of them, there's no way they could assess whether they were going to be in
Mhm,
compliance. But they said 75%. Most of them were like less than 20% compliant. But it doesn't actually matter, because if you're only 75% compliant, you're not compliant.
mhm.
And where everyone really fell down with these, except for some of the open source folks, but definitely all of them had some of the problems with transparency, because they don't actually know
Mhm.
where all of the information, like they could, like the open source could say, this is my data training set, so like that's transparent, whereas the proprietary people think that that's competitive advantage, particularly now. But they don't know exactly when something's generated, why it was generated that way, and so they could develop some
That's the
observability.
explainability aspect, right?
Right,
Like,
right,
yeah,
and, like,
yeah.
there's no answer for that today, and so what does that do then? Does that mean when this goes into, if it goes into effect as it is, that because no one can comply with that part of the act, that
Mhm.
none of these can actually be used?
So, yeah, I mean, the way I would look at that, so I think transparency bit will be about saying, look, did you use, personally identifiable information? Did you
Sure,
use,
understood.
other people's IP in your, and it's transparency. It's not telling you what to do. You just need to be transparent about it. And I think the problem that will cause some companies is they don't really want to pay for other people's IP in their models. So that seems like something that needs to be figured out about if, and then when it comes to the explainability, I do think that's going to be challenging
Yeah.
in terms of, um, let's say I upload 10 CVs and I get recommended to hire this person and I can't explain why. I mean, I think that's where
That'll
you're
be
going
one of the first lawsuits, right? And then, like,
100%. But then should you be using it because we do know that the a lot of the LLMs do have bias in them, right? I mean, and I think the creators have admitted they're not free of bias.
sure. Yeah.
Therefore, f again, let's go back to what's practical here. For the high risk use cases, should it be used at that point? There are going to be other approaches that are already in development, that are going to produce similar to akin to LLMs that don't
Yeah.
use transformer approach, and they will be explainable, right? And people are working on that because for that exact reason, because the computer says no, or the computer says pick that guy,
Yes,
is
yes.
not really a good enough reason when somebody's lost a job or an opportunity or been told they failed an exam and the computer can't. We go, but we love it and it's so productive and it's so cheap and it's scalable. Yeah, but did you fail somebody and you can't explain why? Like, I mean, so you have to get back to a real case of showing where the value is and why that value trumps somebody's opportunity in life being quashed. Like, and it's not, again, like we're saying, is it's not like the AI can't be used for non-high risk use cases. There's a
Yeah,
lot
but
of
but the
classes
high
like
risk
low
use
risk,
cases are very broad.
Hmm?
The high risk use cases are very broad and very easily interpreted as
I don't
well.
think they're that. I don't think they're that. I mean, I've looked at them. I didn't feel they were too broad. I just felt it was. Look, there's a lot more going to shake out in the next while. But again, if you can come up with a reason why you think, you know what, in the grand scheme of things, a couple of thousand people, it getting it wrong, that's okay. I don't know if that's where we should be arriving at, because if AI is really the thing that's going to better society, except for these guys, because the system's bias and we can't really fix it. And, it's a little hard right now to fix it because we don't know how we come up with the data. Well, maybe the innovation should be around filtering the data to make sure you actually know where it is. I mean, it's not like that's beyond us. I sometimes feel like there's a lot of things that we could be employing technology for that is chosen not to, like protecting kids online, the metaverse,
Yeah.
through biometric data. Why aren't we doing that? That exists, right? Nobody's doing it, and we see all these articles appearing all the time about
Because
these kids
well, actually,
wandering around this really inappropriate thing.
you
Huh?
can't collect biometric data on children, so it's like impossible to
You
actually
can.
implement
No,
that.
you can if you get parental permission. So
Mm,
again, you can. I think people just it's just difficult, right? And
yeah,
we've got too many other things to be doing. So you can protect, and we can. The amazing thing is we can use technology and AI to help protect. I think we just have to make those extra leaps, and the will has to be there. And sometimes when the regulation's not there, the will is not there.
yeah. And when you think of bias, like bias is used in a lot of different ways. Like, so for example, weights and biases is this idea. Now, biases we use in a social cultural context is different than what we use in a technical context.
Yes, I would say when it comes to accents and dialects, I think, skin color, age, gender, I think they are kind of somewhat correlated, right? It's
Well,
more of
there's
it
other
should.
types of bias, but there's other types of bias too, right? That can come up, which affects people differently.
And
Um,
for instance, can you give me some, for instance, that you're thinking of? Because I think there's something.
um, sure. I mean, there could be some types of bias in models that, because of the way they're tuned, they're better at answering some questions than others, or they answer some questions in from a certain perspective
Yeah.
versus another. And that perspective could be any perspective. It's just basically what they tuned it for and what they biased the results to, because fine tuning is a form of biasing output. And it just
Yeah.
happens to be guardrails as well are a
Yeah.
form of biasing what you see and what you don't see. And so I was just like, I don't, this is
Yeah,
just like an open
I look
question
at
how
it a
you
little
think
bit
about it.
differently. Yeah, I look at it a little bit differently. I look at it as it's more an objective assessment of a resume, an objective assessment of, like you've heard about these systems where you blind the names and the addresses of people like
Yeah.
that, and all of a sudden the outcomes are completely different. It's an objective assessment of the facts, as opposed to somebody's and social biases we've grown up with. Um, Same with accents, dialects. I mean, I think there's been shown in education, there was like something like a 16% difference in how humans were assessing fluency of children. Again, built correctly, an AI system should be able to objectively
Yeah.
measure the performance of a child. And I love this idea because we often talk about an AI being biased. Well, actually, it's the humans that were biased first that created the biased data that was used in
True.
the AI system. Whereas if we actually just build it right, can we just, we could actually get back to the AI, people thinking about an AI system being the more objective party in it. And just like the self-driving cars are actually safer than humans, but we have to get over this idea that they're not.
Right. Well, because everyone wants to think, okay, well, what are they doing when the trolley problem comes up? The
Yeah.
trolley problem doesn't come up, but that's where you started. You said, hey, listen, there are outliers, which the trolley problem is a clear outlier. But there's also some of these things which are, have much broader impact, and those are really important. You can't just like think of
Yeah.
everything as an outlier if it's not
Yeah.
common. I think
Exactly.
I think that's a really important point. And just maybe we can just close on this because like is the AI ambassador for Ireland. Tell me what you think about Ireland and AI. both from a societal adoption, from an innovation standpoint? How do you think AI is going to impact Ireland? How do you think Ireland's going to impact AI?
Ireland has a very strong research and innovation and startup community, and hub and
Yeah.
culture and kind of inquisitive, but we've a very highly educated workforce as well. So, but there's also very deep curiosity, and people here like to understand what's going on. So the conversations are good here, and they're deep and they're meaty. So people want to know. I'm a very society kind of community driven society here as well.
Yes.
I think that idea of ethical AI resonates very deeply here, and people care about it a lot. So, we're a small country. So I think it's one of these things that people are very, very curious about. We appreciate the technology and the innovation aspect, but we're very minded of how it's going to negatively impact societies as well. So I think, and actually the EU have that same line. So I think the approach and the attitudes are very closely aligned with the EU.
Mhm.
And with my own personal views on it, and I believe we can still innovate and be ethical as well. So I think that's kind of why I took the AI ambassador role, because I felt, I could help tell that story, given my own
Yes.
experience, and it aligns very well with what I feel about this.
Well, I think it's amazing too, because like it was a really good choice on their part, because you come from that background. You're an innovator. You've made it. You've had to confront these ethical choices versus the shortcuts.
Mm,
And so when you're working with the industry, you can talk to them about having that personal experience as opposed to some dispassionate regulator who might come in and like never have had to face that, type of decision. I think that's really good. Plus, I've known you for a number of years. You're very good at explaining this to people. And I find that many of the people who come from the technical research background are not.
thanks.
And they tend to be very insular. It's like they have
Yeah,
their, it's
thank you.
kind of like narrow AI. They're like really good in their own space, but like they're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
very
yeah,
versatile. And I really appreciate you stepping up into a role like this to create that bridge between the technical and between the non-technical, because it is something we need to have a pragmatic discussion about, as opposed to what we often see, which is the alarmists on both sides
yeah.
tend to dominate the debate too often.
Yeah, yeah. No, what I'm really hoping, we're now setting up, as I said, this an AI council, an AI advisory council to the Irish government,
Uh-huh.
that I'll be chairing, and that's one of the objectives, as far as I can see, is that we need, if we're going to bring advice to policymakers, it needs to be objective. It can't be too emotive. It needs to be, we're bringing the technical expertise in.
Yeah, fair enough.
Great.
Patricia Scanlon, this has been amazing. Always great to have you back on the podcast. What should people do to follow up on either what you're doing as an ambassador or SoapBox Labs?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, and on at Scanlon Patricia Twitter, at SoapBox Labs on Twitter, and also on LinkedIn. You can follow us there.
That's amazing. All right, folks, I'm Brett Kinsella, host of the Voicebot podcast. I come here every week with another amazing innovator. Sometimes we do the news too. And a lot of people have been listening to our generative AI news rundowns every week. But this is really what I've enjoyed. I've done, I think, 350 of these
Wow.
at this point, these hour
Wow.
plus long conversations with innovators in the space. I just love it. And it's always my pleasure to have you on, Trish.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Brett.
joining
No,
me.
absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Bye-bye.